He was driving on an empty winter highway when he noticed an unconscious girl lying on the side of the road. The trucker stopped to help, but he didn't expect her papers to reveal the terrible truth. Who was she? Why was she alone in the snow? Watch to the end to find out what happened next. Write in the comments what city you're from. The night stretched long and cold over the endless highway, the asphalt buried beneath thick layers of snow and ice. A fierce wind howled across the plains, carrying the storm with it, slamming against the sides of the truck like a restless ghost. A lone set of headlights cut through the white void, illuminating the deserted road ahead, the only sign of life in a landscape swallowed by winter. Ost gripped the wheel, his knuckles stiff from both the cold and the long hours behind the wheel. He had been on the road since early morning, hauling freight across the northern states. The job was predictable, monotonous even, but that was the way he liked it. There was a certain peace in the routine. Drive, stop for gas, grab a coffee at some nameless truck stop, then drive again. The cab of the truck was warm, the heater humming steadily, contrasting sharply with the bitter cold outside. The radio crackled softly in the background, a local station playing country music mixed with static. He didn't care much for the music, but he let it play. The sound filled the silence, kept the loneliness from pressing in too much. Outside, the storm was worsening. Snow swirled furiously in the headlights, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. The road signs were nearly buried, and the reflectors on the highway barriers barely shone through the thick snowfall. Ost had driven through worse, but something about this particular night made him uneasy. He checked the clock on the dashboard, just past midnight. He still had a couple of hours before he planned to pull over for the night. The nearest motel wasn't too far, but with the way the snow was coming down, he'd have to take it slow. He shifted slightly in his seat, stretching his aching back, when something in the distance caught his eye. A dark shape lay on the side of the road, barely visible against the white. His grip on the wheel tightened. At first, he thought it was just a fallen branch, maybe a discarded piece of tarp blown in from a nearby farm. But as he got closer, he realized it wasn't debris. It was a person. For a moment, Ost's foot hovered over the brake pedal. He had heard stories before about setups on lonely highways, traps where someone would lie on the roadside pretending to be injured while others waited in the dark, ready to ambush anyone foolish enough to stop. It happened more often in the South, but crime didn't have a regional boundary. His instinct screamed at him to keep driving. Whatever trouble this was, it wasn't his. But he hesitated. The wind howled as he slowed the truck, his heart pounding as he inched closer. His headlights swept over the figure, and now he could see more clearly. A woman, curled up in the snow, motionless. Ost cursed under his breath. Maybe it was still a setup. Maybe there was someone watching from the tree line just beyond the road. His fingers twitched against the wheel as he debated what to do. He could drive on, pretend he hadn't seen anything, or he could stop and take the risk. Another gust of wind slammed against the truck. The snow was piling up fast. If she was still alive, she wouldn't last much longer in this cold. He gritted his teeth and flipped on the hazard lights. Slowly, he pulled the truck to the shoulder and put it in park. The engine rumbled beneath him as he reached for his flashlight and shoved open the door. A blast of cold air hit him like a brick wall, instantly numbing his exposed skin. Stepping down from the cab, his boots crunched against the ice-packed road. The wind bit at his face as he made his way toward the figure. She was lying on her side, half buried in the snow, her dark hair tangled around her face. Her clothes were completely inadequate for the weather. A thin jacket, torn jeans, boots that were soaked through. Her skin, where it was visible, was a sickly pale under the weak glow of his flashlight. "Damn it," Ost muttered. He crouched beside her, reaching out carefully. His gloved fingers brushed against her shoulder. She didn't react. He hesitated for just a second before pressing 2 fingers against the side of her neck. A pulse. Weak, but there. His breath came out in a heavy cloud. She was alive, but not for much longer if she stayed out here. He stood quickly, glancing toward the tree line, half expecting to see movement. But the darkness beyond the highway was still. If this was a trap, it was a damn good one. He bent down and scooped her up into his arms. She was frighteningly light, barely more than skin and bones. Her head lolled against his chest, and he could feel the faint shudder of her breath against his jacket. Ost turned and made his way back to the truck, his boots slipping slightly on the ice. He climbed into the cab, carefully placing her in the passenger seat. The heater blasted warm air, but it wasn't enough. She needed more than just heat. Reaching behind his seat, he grabbed an old wool blanket, one he kept for cold nights when the heater wasn't enough. He wrapped it around her, tucking it close. She stirred slightly, a faint, barely audible sound escaping her lips, but she didn't wake. Ost exhaled, shaking his head. "What the hell am I doing?" he muttered to himself. This wasn't his problem. He should have kept driving. He didn't need to get involved in whatever mess this was, but it was too late for that now. He shifted the truck into gear and eased back onto the road, the massive tires crunching over fresh snow. The storm was getting worse. Visibility was down to almost nothing. He needed to get to town, get her someplace warm where she could get proper help. As he drove, he glanced at her every now and then. Her breathing was shallow but steady. A few more hours. That's all it would take. Just get her to town. And this would be someone else's problem. The rhythmic hum of the truck's engine filled the cab, steady and unchanging, a comforting contrast to the storm raging outside. The snow continued to fall thick and fast, swirling past the windshield in chaotic flurries. Ost kept his grip firm on the wheel, his focus split between the treacherous road ahead and the unconscious woman beside him. The highway stretched endlessly in front of him, a winding ribbon of ice and shadows. The heater blasted warmth through the cab, but it didn't seem to be helping much. Her skin was still too cold, her body too still. Every so often, he flicked a glance at her, watching for any sign of movement. Then, finally, she stirred. At first, it was just the faintest shift, a twitch of her fingers beneath the wool blanket. Then, a sharp intake of breath, almost like a gasp. Ost kept his eyes on the road, pretending he hadn't noticed, but he could feel the shift in the air. A moment later, she made a noise, low, confused, like someone surfacing from a deep, dark sleep. He glanced over. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first before slowly scanning her surroundings. And then, suddenly, she tensed. He could feel it before he even turned to look at her. The rigid way her body went stiff, the sharp inhale of breath. Her fingers gripped the edge of the blanket so tightly that her knuckles paled. Panic. He had seen it before. "Easy," he muttered, more to himself than to her. She didn't relax. Her breath quickened, shallow and rapid like a cornered animal. Her gaze darted around the cab, taking everything in. The dashboard, the seats, the window, the door handle. Ost knew what she was thinking. Where am I? Who is this man? Am I safe? She shifted slightly, still wrapped in the blanket, but clearly trying to gauge her chances. Her gaze finally landed on him. There was no trust in her eyes, only fear. He didn't blame her. For a long stretch of road, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the wind against the truck, the tires sloshing through the snow. Then, finally, she spoke. Her voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper. It took him a second to register what she had said. "Where are we?" Ost hesitated. He wasn't sure how much to say. "Highway 19, he answered eventually. "Heading east." She swallowed, her throat dry. Where are you taking me?" "Nearest town. It's a couple hours out." She flinched slightly at that, like she didn't like the sound of it. Her fingers tightened around the blanket. "No," she said, shaking her head weakly. No town. They'll—" Her voice cut off, as if realizing she had already said too much. Ost frowned. He kept his eyes on the road, but his mind was racing. They'll what? Who was she talking about? For a moment, he considered letting it go. He had already done more than enough. He had picked her up, saved her from the cold. That was it. That was all he had to do. But something about the way she looked at him, like she was waiting for him to turn against her, made his stomach twist. A deep, unsettled feeling curled in his gut. "You got a name?" he asked after a long pause. She hesitated, then, barely above a whisper, "Maya." The name settled between them like a fragile thing. She didn't ask for his. They drove in silence for a while. The storm raged on outside, reducing visibility to almost nothing. The highway was empty, just an endless stretch of white and darkness. Then, slowly, haltingly, she started talking. Not all at once. Not in a clear, easy way. It came in pieces, fragmented, cautious, as if she was still debating whether or not to trust him. She told him she had been traveling with a group of people. She had believed them when they promised work, a fresh start. She hadn't thought twice when they told her to get into the van, to hand over her phone for security reasons. She only realized the truth when it was too late. The place they took her wasn't a job site. It wasn't anything like what they had promised. It was a compound, fenced in, guarded. There were others like her, people who had been taken, trapped. Maya's voice was quiet but steady as she spoke. Ost could hear the exhaustion in it, the deep, gnawing fear that still clung to her. "They took everything," she said. "IDs, passports, money, phones." A pause, then, "Names." The word sent a chill down his spine. "They don't want us to exist," she murmured. "Not on paper, not anywhere." Ost clenched his jaw. He had heard stories before. Human trafficking, labor scams, people being lured in with false promises. But this was something else. "They sell people," Maya said flatly. Ost's hands tightened on the wheel. She told him what she had overheard. Whispers in the night, murmured conversations when they thought no one was listening. They weren't just selling people for labor, they were selling them for parts, organs. Maya had seen a man get taken away one night. A few days later, she heard them talking about how much money his shipment had brought in. She had run the first chance she got. She hadn't thought she would make it. Ost exhaled slowly. His fingers drummed against the wheel. His mind was spinning, trying to process what she had just told him. It sounded impossible. It sounded insane. But she wasn't lying. Her hands trembled slightly beneath the blanket. She wasn't just scared. She was hunted. And then, in the rearview mirror, he saw something that made his stomach drop. Headlights. A single car, far behind them, but moving steadily in the same direction. Ost watched it for a long moment, his pulse kicking up a notch. Could be nothing. Could be just another poor bastard trying to make it through the storm. but something in his gut told him otherwise. He flicked a glance at Maya. She had seen it too. Her breath hitched. "They found me," she whispered. Ost gritted his teeth. For the first time that night, he realized this wasn't just about getting her to safety. This was about keeping her alive. The truck rumbled steadily down the icy highway, but inside the cab, the atmosphere was anything but calm. The distant headlights in the rearview mirror hadn't disappeared. They lingered, unwavering, moving at the same pace as Ost's rig. He tried to convince himself it was nothing, just another vehicle making its way through the storm. But deep down, he knew better. He'd driven this route enough times to know when something felt wrong. Maya sat stiffly in the passenger seat, still wrapped in the wool blanket, her breath shallow and uneven. She hadn't spoken since the moment she saw the car. She didn't need to. The tension in her posture, the way her fingers clenched at the fabric, she already knew. "They found me." Her words echoed in his head. Ost exhaled slowly, keeping his grip steady on the wheel. He needed to think. He could still make the easy choice. Drop her off at the next town. Let her deal with whatever trouble she'd brought with her. It wasn't his fight. He wasn't a cop. He wasn't a hero. He was just a truck driver who had made the mistake of stopping when he should have kept driving. But even as the thought crossed his mind, he knew he wouldn't do it. Not after what she had told him. The things she had seen. The things they had done to people like her. Selling them like cattle, carving them up for profit. No. He wasn't about to hand her over to whoever was in that car. His mind raced through options. The nearest town wasn't far, but if they had tracked her this far, it wouldn't be safe. The police? Could he trust them? Maya had said they were involved, and it wasn't hard to believe. If the people behind this were as powerful as she claimed, there was no telling how deep their influence ran, which meant there was only one person he could call. Ost clenched his jaw and reached for his phone. The number was one he hadn't dialed in years. It rang 3 times before a voice answered, low, wary, like a man who had learned to expect bad news. "Whoever this is, it better be good." Ost didn't waste time. "It's me." A pause, then, "Ost Carter. Well, damn. Didn't think I'd ever hear your voice again." "Wish you weren't." Ost flicked a glance at the rearview mirror. The car was still there. "I've got a problem." A long sigh crackled through the speaker. "That so? What kind of problem?" "The kind you used to dig into." That got his attention. "Jesus, what did you step in?" "Not me. A girl. She's in trouble. Real trouble." There was a beat of silence. Then the voice on the other end said, "Where are you?" Ost told him. Another pause, then, "All right, bring her in. But understand something. If you're telling me the truth, you just put yourself in the middle of something real damn ugly." "Yeah," Ost muttered. "I figured." The call ended. Maya was watching him now, eyes wide with uncertainty. Who was that? She asked quietly. A guy who might be able to help. She swallowed, as if weighing whether or not to believe him. Then she looked back at the mirror, at the car trailing behind them. "How do we know we'll make it there?" Ost's grip tightened on the wheel. "We don't," he admitted, "but we don't have a better choice." He pressed his foot down on the gas. The truck picked up speed, tires crunching over the snow-covered road. The storm had let up slightly, but visibility was still poor. The headlights behind them didn't waver. Ost watched them closely. If they sped up, if they tried to close the distance, then there would be no doubt. They were being hunted. Minutes passed. Then, movement. The car behind them suddenly veered into the other lane, inching closer. Ost swore under his breath. They weren't waiting anymore. Maya sucked in a breath. "Ost," I see it. His mind worked fast. He couldn't outrun them. Not in a rig this big, not on these roads. If they tried to force him off the highway, things could get ugly fast. He needed to shake them, buy time, force them to hesitate. His eyes scanned the road ahead. A turnoff. A narrow service road leading away from the highway. It would be risky, but it was their best shot. Hold on. He yanked the wheel hard. The truck lurched, tires skidding slightly as it veered off the main road. Snow kicked up in a thick spray behind them as they barreled down the unmarked path. The car hesitated. Then, with a screech of tires, it followed. The road twisted through a stretch of dense woods, flanked by skeletal trees buried under snow. Ost pushed the truck as fast as he dared, but the path was narrow, winding. The car was smaller, faster. It was gaining on them. He spotted the marker up ahead, an old warehouse half buried in snow just off the road. Ost had been here before, years ago, when the man he was meeting still worked in the field. He pulled in fast, killing the headlights. The truck rumbled to a stop. Maya looked at him, breathing heavily. Now what? We wait. Outside, another set of headlights cut through the dark. The car pulled in slowly. Then the warehouse doors creaked open. A figure stepped out. Ost exhaled. It was him, the man he had called, the only one who could help. Maya tensed. Who is that? Ost met her gaze. His name's Jake. She hesitated. Can we trust him? Ost didn't answer right away, but then he opened the door, and together they stepped into the unknown. The inside of the warehouse was cold and smelled of dust, oil, and old wood. Ost stepped forward first, his boots echoing in the cavernous space, his breath curling in the dim light. Maya hesitated behind him, clutching the wool blanket tightly around her shoulders. Jake stood near a makeshift desk, a folding table cluttered with a laptop, stacks of paper, and a half-empty coffee cup. He looked exactly how Ost remembered him. Tall, wiry, sharp-eyed, the kind of man who saw angles before anyone else did. His hair was grayer now, the lines around his mouth deeper, but the air of quiet intensity hadn't changed. He flicked his gaze over Ost, then to Maya, assessing her in an instant. This her? Jake asked. Ost nodded. Yeah. Jake let out a slow breath and studied Maya for a moment. His gaze wasn't unkind, but it was sharp, calculating. You sure about this? Maya stiffened beside Ost. I don't have a choice, she said, her voice quieter than before. Jake studied her a moment longer, then gestured toward a chair near the table. Sit. Tell me everything. She hesitated. Ost could feel her looking at him, silently asking if this was the right move. He gave her a slight nod. Slowly, she sat. Maya spoke in halting sentences at first, but as the words left her mouth, as the memories surfaced, the dam broke. She told Jake everything. The recruitment, how she and others had been promised work, decent wages, a fresh start, how they had been transported in vans with blacked-out windows, their belongings taken from them the moment they arrived at the compound. How they were given no names, no identities, just numbers. Then the disappearances. People taken in the middle of the night. The rumors. Some were sent to work in places where they were never heard from again. Others were taken elsewhere. Organs. That word lingered in the air, heavy and unspoken. Ungs could go for. How they whispered about shipments and buyers. How she saw a man, one of the others imprisoned with her, being dragged out of a room, his face gray, his body limp. And how, one night, she found a way out. She ran. No phone, no money, no sense of where she was, just the blind instinct to escape before they took her next. Ost watched Jake closely as Maya spoke. He didn't interrupt, didn't react, not in any obvious way. But Ost knew him well enough to see the slight narrowing of his eyes, the subtle tightening of his jaw. When Maya finally stopped talking, the silence in the warehouse felt suffocating. Jake exhaled through his nose and pinched the bridge of his nose. "Jesus Christ," he muttered. Ost crossed his arms. "So, what now?" Jake didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached for his laptop, fingers moving fast over the keys. Screens flashed in the dim light. Documents, maps, photos. Then he turned the screen toward them. Ost's stomach tightened. It was an article, one of the deep web kind, the type that didn't make it to the mainstream news. A report about missing people. A pattern of disappearances stretching across multiple states. All of them black. All of them poor. All of them forgotten. Jake scrolled down. More articles. More reports. Connections to certain businesses, political figures, law enforcement. "Your story isn't the first," Jake said grimly. "But it might be the first with proof." Jake reached forward and gently took Maya's coat from the chair next to her. He flipped it inside out, feeling along the seams. Then, with a flick of his pocket knife, he cut into the lining. Something small and metallic tumbled out. Maya gasped. A GPS tracker. Jake sighed and rubbed his face. "They've been following you the whole time." Ost felt a slow burn of anger rise in his chest. He had known, deep down, that things were bad. But this was something else. Jake grabbed his phone and started making calls. Fast, sharp conversations with people Ost didn't know and didn't care to. The kind of people who knew how to make things happen. Then he turned to Maya. "You still want to fight this?" Maya looked exhausted. She looked scared, but she didn't hesitate. "Yes." Jake nodded. "Then we're blowing this thing open." Jake worked fast. He pulled up files, emails, encrypted messages. He connected to servers Ost didn't understand. Uploaded documents to places the government couldn't reach fast enough. He didn't just send the information to the press. He sent it everywhere. Law enforcement, activists, independent journalists. Within minutes, the first reports hit the internet. A leaked list of missing persons, documents connecting private corporations to underground markets, bank transfers, coded messages between officials. And then, live news coverage. A break-in report flashed on a nearby screen. Federal investigation launched into missing persons case. Anonymous whistleblower leaks documents linking high-profile figures to human trafficking scandal. FBI raids suspected compounds in multiple states. It spread like wildfire. Maya watched in stunned silence as the world reacted. Her world, the nightmare she had escaped, was now public. Then, the power in the warehouse cut out. Ost went rigid. Jake cursed. "Damn it, they're on to us." Outside, headlights appeared in the darkness. More than one car. Ost's instincts screamed at him. "Move!" he snapped. Jake grabbed his bag. Maya hesitated only for a second before she ran with them. They barely made it to the truck before the gunshots started. Ost threw the rig into gear. The tires screeched against the ice as they tore away from the warehouse. In the side mirror, he saw figures moving in the dark. Too late, assholes. They were already gone. They drove through the night, through back roads and unmarked paths. They didn't stop until the city skyline rose in the distance. Jake knew people. He got Maya to a safe house, hidden among those who knew how to protect people like her. Ost didn't ask for details. He had done his part. The next day, the full weight of what they had done came crashing down. the arrests started. The corporations behind the trafficking network exposed. The law enforcement officials who had helped cover it up taken down. The politicians who had profited, running for their lives. But Ost knew better than to believe it was over. There would always be more like them. More men with money, power, influence. More people who thought they could buy and sell human lives. But there would also be people like Maya. People who refused to disappear. People who fought back. A week later, Ost sat at a truck stop diner drinking his coffee. The storm had passed. On the TV, a news anchor was still talking about the case. More arrests, more discoveries. He felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not pride. Not exactly. Just the knowledge that, for once, he had done the right thing. And maybe that was enough. He finished his coffee, paid his bill, and walked back to his truck. The road stretched ahead of him, endless as ever. But somehow, it didn't feel quite so empty anymore. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss upcoming videos. Watch the next one here or explore more on the channel. And if you found this video interesting, share it with others.